Edifice of Trust podcast is a thoughtful discussion of today's current events from the perspective of America's founding principles. Welcome. From heart-pumping music to head-thumping commentary. The Way of Junzi. Henry Kissinger's latest book, Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy, published in 2022, is an amazing tour de force. In it, he describes the attributes of 6 great leaders of the 20th century that had made them not just great leaders, but transformational figures that shaped the future of their countries and the world around them. Amazingly, he had met all of these leaders and was friends with a number of them. He first met Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1946 to 1963. We called it West Germany back then, in 1957. That was 65 years ago, and he's writing about it now. The man is not only super smart, but at 99 years of age, prolific. I also recently read another book of his, The Age of AI and Our Human Future, published in 2021, that he co-authored with Eric Schmidt and Daniel Huttenlocher. In his book, Mr. Kissinger profiles the leadership of 6 important 20th century heads of state: Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, President of France from 1959 to 1969, Richard Nixon, President of the United States from 1969 to 1974, Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt from 1970 to 1981, Lee Kuan Yew, Prime Minister of Singapore from 1959 to 1990, and Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1979 to 1990. But I was most interested in learning more about Lee Kuan Yew, who I knew little about. I was interested in Lee Kuan Yew because I knew that he had transformed Singapore from a swampy colonial backwater into a wealthy and important city-state, primarily through the force of his own will. But I didn't know how he did it. Mr. Lee was born in colonial Singapore in 1923 to English-speaking parents of Chinese descent. Mr. Lee excelled in school and hoped to study law at Cambridge University in England, but his plans were interrupted when Japan invaded Malaysia on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, eventually conquering Singapore in February 1942. Surviving the brutal occupation of the Japanese through luck and grit, after the war, he was able to win a Queen's Scholarship to attend Cambridge, graduating in 1949 with first honors. He returned to Singapore and gained a solid legal reputation defending trade unions and left-wing students. In 1954, with the support of the trade unions that he had helped, Lee formed the People's Action Party, the PAP, and was elected to the Legislative Assembly during the transition to independence. After independence, Singapore briefly joined Malaysia in a confederation, but Malaysian suspicion of majority Chinese Singapore led to a breakup in 1965, and Singapore became an independent nation. During the colonial period, Singapore was considered mostly a swamp with a British naval base. And how did Mr. Lee raise Singapore's GDP per capita from $517 at the time of independence to $72,794 now, especially since Malaysia, right next door, raised its GDP per capita of $310 to only $11,371 in the same period. Mr. Lee and the PAP rose to power as a left-wing party promoting a social democratic agenda, just a few steps short of communism. The main focus of his efforts was to improve the poor housing of the city, only a third of the inhabitants had adequate housing, and rampant corruption only made worse by the Japanese occupation. Mr. Li set about building high-rise apartments that residents could eventually purchase from the housing board, a very non-left-wing strategy. Home ownership is the basic building block of creating prosperity. Mr. Li also stamped out corruption by ruthless measures and stiff penalties. Corrupt government is at the root of a system of impunity for perpetrators that violates the social contract and destroys the people's trust in government. Rooting out corruption gave Singaporeans the belief that the government was indeed working for the benefit of the people. But Singapore is a jumble of ethnicities. Almost 3/4 are from the Chinese diaspora, but it also includes Malays, Indians, and others, and religions, including Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and many others. Very serious race riots hammered the city just before independence, killing and injuring many people. Kuan Yew had to forge this hodgepodge of peoples and cultures into a nation. How did he do it? One way was to create a plethora of civic organizations to service the wide-ranging needs of his diverse population, similar to the civic organizations that so amazed de Tocqueville during his visit to America in 1830, but which Singapore lacked. He also poured money, a third of the government's expenditures, into education. In a city where many people only spoke their native tongue, various dialects of Chinese, Malay, Tamil, and English, he mandated that all schools teach at least 2 languages, one of which must be English. Mr. Li believed that only a tightly knit, rugged, adaptable people, united by a common national identity, could resist internal disorder. The sacrifices that had to be borne to eventually achieve independence and prosperity could only be sustained by a sense of common belonging and shared destiny. The people must speak a common language so that citizens could communicate with each other. They must also share a common Singaporean culture along with their individual native cultures, a culture that Mr. Li hoped would inspire Singaporeans to become Junzi, the Confucian concept of a gentleman or moral person. But how to grow the economy so that people could achieve the prosperity they desired? While many developing countries denounced capitalist exploitation and investment by international corporations, Mr. Li stated, quote, "All we had was labor. So why not, if they want to exploit our labor? They're welcome to it," unquote. Lacking capital, there was no other way. Basic industries at first, to take advantage of a willing but unskilled workforce, but over time, excellence in education developed a more sophisticated workforce that attracted more advanced industries and provided more promotions into management for highly skilled and well-educated Singaporeans. This is how Lee Kuan Yew converted an economic backwater with little land and no resources, still reeling from wartime occupation with a polyglot population of many ethnicities, into a modern dynamic city-state, building a unique Singaporean culture overlying a welter of disparate native cultures, developing meritocracy that extended from grade school to university to industry and commerce, number 2 in the OECD PISA rankings, relying on free market economics to develop wealth and prosperity. Even poor Singaporeans are better off than their Malaysian neighbors, and aligning with the West and America as the best way to help its people thrive. Some of Mr. Li's methods might not sit well with many Americans. He passed very strict laws about how to behave in public, much more strict than the broken windows policies of New York City. Mr. Li believed, much as John Adams did, that people needed a moral code of conduct in order to be successful. His 31 years in office rivaled that of many monarchs and dictators. But in a democracy, people will re-elect a leader if they continue to do a good job. Problems arise only when the leader does not do a good job but refuses to relinquish power. The People's Action Party Mr. Li founded, now considered a center-right party rather than a far-left party, continues to govern Singapore even after his retirement and death. But America does not have to mimic Mr. Lee's methods to be successful. America would be better off by revitalizing its Western culture that led it to become the richest, most powerful country in the world, than by discarding it for economic and political systems that have been abysmal failures to the extent that they have even been tried. And America is not just rich and powerful. It has been a beacon of hope for billions of people around the world. Ponder that while you watch a brief message.
Don't forget that my Edifice of Trust books, Principled Policy, Edifice of Trust 2nd edition, In Defense of Principle, and The People's God are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks. Thank you.
Welcome back. President Biden touts his blue-collar background, but he has discarded America's middle-class values in favor of the progressive values of academics and elitists. Dr. Kissinger emphasizes in his book about how the great leaders of the 20th century that he describes all claimed a middle-class upbringing, but he also focuses on the characteristics that led them to greatness. People from middle-class backgrounds can only rise to leadership in a meritocratic system. But in a meritocratic system, it is a person's talents and abilities and not aristocratic birth that grants the opportunities for advancement. But intelligence, while essential, is not sufficient. The leaders evinced a strong code of conduct and sense of morality and high purpose. As Dr. Kissinger noted, quote, both the school system and the broader society in which they were raised put a premium on academic performance, but both, above all, placed a strong emphasis on character. Kuan Yew aimed to become Junzi, a Confucian gentleman or moral person, while de Gaulle aspired to be, quote, a man of character. It was this type of character by which Martin Luther King dreamed his children would be judged. These middle-class values included, quote, personal discipline, self-improvement, charity, patriotism, and self-belief. Each of the leaders held a strong sense of national identity that motivated them to serve their fellow citizens. Dr. Kissinger quotes historian Christopher Lasch as saying, quote, middle-class nationalism provided a common ground, common standards, a common frame of reference, without which society dissolves into nothing more than contending factions. It was these values that Lee Kuan Yew encouraged his fellow Singaporeans to adopt, because without them his nation would have been doomed to third world mediocrity like many of his neighbors. It is exactly these values that are being disparaged by the progressive left in their woke ideology. Quotas replace advanced placement testing. Ideological conformity trumps free speech. Victimhood supersedes empowerment. Redistribution is substituted for production. The individual is subsumed into group identity. This is a recipe for third world mediocrity, not global leadership. Dr. Kissinger concludes his book by bringing us back to the 21st century with some reflection about the future we face. Quote, it now seems possible that a liberal, rules-based order, however worthy in its conception, will be replaced in practice for an indeterminate period of time by an at least partially decoupled world. We need to be prepared for that world, and woke ideology will not do that. He concludes, quote, lacking a moral and strategic vision, the present age is unmoored. The vastness of our future as yet defies comprehension. Thank you.